Zafiris, Tzannatos. Dr. Ibrahim is online. I'm not sure whether he'll be contributing or not, but we have Dr. Zafiris with us today. Let me introduce Dr. Zafiris and Dr. Ibrahim Saif. Dr. Zafiris, Senior Fellow, Jordan Strategy Forum. He is an economist based in Jordan, currently Senior Fellow at the Jordan Strategy Forum and the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies in Lebanon, where he was previously Professor and Chair of Economics Department at the American University of Beirut. He has been a Senior Advisor for the Arab States at the ILO office in Beirut. And before that, an advisor to the Managing Director at the World Bank, as well as Manager for the MENA region. His current research is on the Middle East and the Euro crisis. This is Dr. Zafiris, Tzannatos. We have to introduce also Dr. Ibrahim Saif, who is a co-author of the same paper. Dr. Ibrahim is the CEO of Jordan Strategy Forum. Previously, he served as the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources from March 2015 to June 2017, and the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation from March 2013 till March 2015. Prior to his appointment as minister, Dr. Saif was senior scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center and served as a consultant to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other international organizations. Dr. Saif was also a former director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan and served as the Secretary General of the Economic and Social Council in Jordan. He has taught at both the University of London and Yale University, where he led courses on the economies of the Middle East. Now, I will give the floor to Dr. Zafiris, Tzannatos to present their paper. So please go ahead, Dr. Tzannatos.
Professor Mahdi, and I know it's the worst time to speak after lunch, and also it's not a good time to speak after the IMF. Our colleagues from the IMF said it all. So I will go off script also because Dr. Ibrahim said he may not join or he may join late. So as I said, I will go off script. And the first thing I want to say is, what am I doing here? I was wondering, but I was inspired by Raja, who said, let me tell you where I come from. I come from the World Bank, and of course this is IMF, but I'm in good company here with Ibrahim al-Badawi, he's not here, and Mustapha and Ishaq and Hafiz and Kevin from the US. I think Kevin must be online. Apologies for being plugged for an hour now before we started.
Recording in progress.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things that I was inspired from the previous presentations. One is I come from Greece, right? So I'm very proud the word kleptocracy comes from the Greeks. The word odious debt also was first coined about 300 years before Common Era, and it was mentioned by Noam Chomsky after the Greek crisis, and he said, no, you should not pay. The problem with Noam was that when the dictatorship fell in Greece, the debt was 18%, and within 20 years it went to 180%. And this takes us back to Adnan, how you define it, how you measure it, which part is odious, and then what to do without it. I can now start saying something about this presentation or the paper we have, which is assessing the sustainability of Jordan's public debt. We presented it in a workshop in Jordan, and one reviewer said, you say it all except one sentence, that it's not sustainable. But we heard already how we present these papers, not because of the Sudanese colleagues who expect to become ministers in the next one, but you write it in a way that you should read it between the lines. So here we take the cue from the IMF, which says, yes, it is, but. So exactly this is our line. And also it was mentioned by the IMF colleagues that when you do stabilization, you are interested in the next 2, 3, 4 years. And in fact, the IMF was interested until 2025. This has slipped into 2027 now already, although the program started in 2019. So there is no single answer. Is it sustainable? In what sense and over what period? So we play around with this concept and we put it aside. Why? Because the mechanics of fiscal accounting or stabilization are known. We are not going to match what the IMF has done. And it has a very elaborate model now that includes also the impact of climate adaptation. These are things that I don't think any academic department and any researcher has access to and cannot compete with the IMF. So there are numbers of numbers with assumptions and other assumptions, and the question is hanging, the answer is hanging in the air. What we have done is we argue that the way to reduce the debt to GDP ratio is through growth. Where will this growth come from? From the private sector. And what is at the end the objective of this growth is the social impact. So we play around with what is needed or why the private sector is growing. What is the impact on the social sectors? And in Jordan and other Arab countries, we know the greatest opposition to reform is the social impact. And we have a series of cases, not only in Jordan, where the reforms stall after they are agreed because of political economic considerations. And it was mentioned here, the political dimension. And what we have in the paper is we raise a question. We want private sector growth. What is the key element there? It's economic contestability. And we raise the question, can you have economic contestability without political contestability? And there are a few papers on that, recent and older ones, or the recent ones recycle old ideas. But this is an issue we raise, but again, we do not answer. So I will take you just through a few mechanics we have there. And the outline of the paper is this. I will not go through this given the time pressure. And we have a brief historical review like the other papers did, not as good as those ones for Sudan and Lebanon. Then we said, we examine what are the price sector dynamics and social sector dynamics, what's happening in the social sectors. And then we go what needs to be done, which is known, and what we propose. And then we conclude, can it be done and will debt sustainability be assured? Yes, but this is the IMF language, right? So we have demanding reform agenda. 400 initiatives have been agreed as conditionalities or as being volunteered by the government. Few have been implemented. And then will the external funding continue? And that was mentioned against today. Raja, I think, mentioned it, that support has from donors, bilaterals, has gone down from 8% to 2%. And of course, there are other crises coming, and the geopolitical interest can shift away from Jordan to support some other countries in the region. So that is the paper. Now, let me just take you through the dynamics, and the implications are very clear. We have here, if you can see, if I can see it, yeah, 1976. Why did we pick up that? Because that's the beginning of the oil boom. And already it was mentioned that neighboring countries have benefited, neighboring Arab countries to the GCC have benefited after the oil boom from support from the Arab brothers in the GCC. And you can see things went up until 1982, when it was the oil price bust. Then Jordan went down. What happened? Then Jordan went down. Jordan went down from 3.5 1,500 to 213. The IMF comes in. There is a serious devaluation from 3.5 to 1.4 or something like that. Then the Palestinian returnees come. They brought capital and everything. In the 1990s, Jordan had 4 IMF programs. It was shown that earlier today. And then we have a tremendous boom between 2000 and 2010, and the per capita GDP fully recovered. And then what happened? Then we had the global financial crisis, the Arab Spring, the Syrian refugees, ISIS, and the disruption of trade routes through Syria. They had with a saga with the Egyptian gas supply. We had COVID. We have war in Ukraine. So there is a lot to be blamed there. However, as the World Bank says, a lot of this boom was from the Iraqi refugees and the FDI they brought. If you speak to the locals, it was money laundering and a lot of investment in construction and other activities. So effectively, one can say that yes, the Syrians can be blamed here, the refugees, but where Jordan is today could have been in 2002, since 2003 was Saddam overthrown and the Iraqis start coming in. Now, something that has been missed in this discourse is this. When the debt declined by 1/3, it was because the debt increase, the amount of borrowing, was 2/3 of the increase. Jordan kept borrowing relentlessly from 6 billion to 12 billion throughout the 2000s. So they didn't fix the roof when the sun was out. And this raises the question, are we dealing with different political situation today that will address the issue that did not address then? And if it addresses them, what will be the impact of austerity? So we're talking about a very fine balance between austerity now and the impact on the social sectors. The bottom line is unemployment. And we take it as an indication of social conditions, and also because through unemployment, you link the fiscal with the private sector. As you can see, unemployment didn't budge at all these years. It was 20% then, 20% in 2020. Now it's 24 or 25. It's the COVID, it's the war in Russia, and all these excuses or real events. Fine. But if you read anything, including the letter of intent from the Minister of Finance just weeks ago to the IMF, he says we have a problem with youth and women's unemployment. And it is everywhere in the Middle East. We love this kind of phrase. Why? Because the youth do not have skills. Blame the education. This is public sector, right? These are teachers, unionized teachers. And of course, in all countries, there are no skills. Why? Because the skills come after technology is introduced, and that technology is used by production. But in Jordan, you have labor-intensive, low-value-added, and low-wage employment. You don't have skills. The biggest exporter of commodity of Jordan is its educated workers. There are about 600,000 in the world and 1.2 million in the private sector in Jordan. So it doesn't bode there that lack of skills. Yes, lack of local skills, but the country produces skills that does not retain them. Then you have the gender issue. Of course, it is these Muslims that they treat their women so badly. Let's focus on the last. So we're looking at the bottom line. These are two lines here. The blue line is the increase in male unemployment rate. The bottom line is the increase in the female unemployment rate. So, is it a gender issue? No, it's a structural issue. Why is that? Back to where we started, the lack of dynamism in the private sector. In fact, in Jordan, there are twice as many unemployed men as unemployed women. You will not make a dent in unemployment if the number of unemployed men is more than twice as unemployed women. The difference is smaller between the young people and adults because we're dealing with a country with high fertility and a population pyramid pyramid, which is really, really flat. So already we're dealing with one issue. We try to find out what are the problems and the dynamics of the economy and the situation in the social sector. So today, Jordan is where it was in 2002 in per capita income, where it was in 1977. So there hasn't been much change that people can see in their everyday life. Unemployment is as high as it has ever been, and it's becoming more a male, an adult issue. And this creates, this then feeds back to the private sector. So a few things, one slide on the private sector, everything goes down. The first one is TFP and labor productivity over the years. The second thing is economic complexity. And we know, and it's very abundant evidence for that, that over the last 20 years, economic complexity has declined in Jordan, which means the economy is moving to low productivity, low value added, low wages economy. That's why they don't have skills, right? Because the skills emigrate. More important is the red line, which shows the rank of the country. And in a globalized world, what matters is not the level, the blue line. It matters how fast you move relatively to others. And in a country that has a fixed, a pegged exchange rate for 30 years, and exports are twice as many as imports for all these years, there are very interesting stories that one can say, and the Lebanese case, I think, can be used as an example. So everything goes down in the private sector. And what is the effect of overspending by the government is that capital formation from the government has gone down, has collapsed actually in the last few years. And given the economic situation, overall capital formation has been cut by half, while FDI is practically zero. So yes, you have to do all these reforms in the private sector, but you start from a very low base. How many FDI will come so quickly unless you have institutional reforms that are convincing and they will not be reversed? And the other are institutional factors. One is the Economic Freedom Index since 2019. The other is the rule of law. So everything seems to be going against the expectation that the private sector can play an important role in increasing the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio. So effectively, I'm trying to cut it short. This is the last slide. I think maybe I have another one. So the line we take, that's our premise, that the debt to GDP ratio is increasing by the denominator, that is private sector growth. If it increases by the government, then it adds to the debt. To increase the numerator, of course, requires taxes, and they have started collecting more taxes, but from my own country, Greece, which is an excellent example in this respect, once you introduce taxes, you catch people by surprise in year one. By year two, they learn how to go under the table and evade. Bulgaria is booming now from Greek companies that emigrated there and operate from there. Little space for cutting operational spending. The government spends only 4% of its budget on investment. So the rest is pensions and wages and the like. It was mentioned at some point that the debt to GDP ratio is 90%. This is partly because of creative accounting. In Greece, we were experts. We cheated with the Europeans until they sent their forensics, and they found that the deficit in debt, it's much higher than we were saying. So the 90% that is quoted for Jordan is more than 110%. Why? Because they exclude the Social Security Corporation's funding, although there are studies that in 20 years, the whole thing will explode. So as the IMF says, till 2027, yes, the debt is sustainable, although they have a lot of questions, but even if that is the case, after that, we're having headwinds. What needs to be done is known by the government and everybody. Government has repeated visions, strategies, plans, policies, programs, projects that are rarely implemented or they start with a lot of studies and committees, but at the end, the progress is very slow. I don't want to be negative. Something is happening, but not at the envisaged rate and time span. So we know what it is from domestic documents and from the IMF and the World Bank and all the billions that they are giving. Somehow I have a feeling that Jordan gets more support from IMF and the World Bank than Egypt, but I will leave it to others, this part. Now, why it has not been done? I mean, that's what we call debt snowballing, is one strategy, and it is advisable, yes. I mean, push it a little bit, deal with the immediate ones, and then leave the others for later. And it was mentioned today that recent debt has more favorable interest rates than the arrears. And in fact, Jordan had Eurobonds about a month or two ago, and it was touted that we got it at a very good rate. It's true. It was at a lower rate than the arrears, and lower rate even than other countries are currently borrowing. But guess what? The interest rate is still double the rate of economic growth. I think Ishaq mentioned that, that if the interest you have to pay is faster than your economic growth, every year you lose the difference in terms of debt obligations. And something else that has happened is that the debt is becoming increasingly external, and despite these favorable conditions on external debt, it is increasing pretty fast. I will not say exponentially. So what should be done? I mean, refrain from increasing expenditures more, switch expenditures towards the poor, and the big hole there is the pension. People retire at the age of 40 and 50. There have been many pension reforms, including from our former colleague and former Prime Minister, Omar Razaz. And then what? It was reversed. And just in September, the Jordanians introduced a term that I cannot describe. Usually when you do reforms, you use the term grandfathering. That is, those in the system, you let them go out. So they introduced a pension reform in 2003, and the first retirees started coming in 2023. And guess what they said? For the name of equity, these retirees now have to have the same pension as their already existing retirees, the grandfather, assuming they have the same conditions. They are on the same rank in the army, or they have the same time they have spent there. So we're dealing with a situation where you agree on something and then you have policy reversals. Policy delays you can understand, the war in Ukraine or other things. So pensions is a big elephant in the room. NEPCO is a big hole. My co-author Ibrahim was Minister of Energy. I don't know whether he's in line and he wants to say something. You know the situation of water and how complex it is also with Israel there. And also you have climate adaptation, which is coming to Jordan like a snowball. I think I finished. So let me go back to the question that the reviewer asked in Jordan when we have the workshop. Will the debt be sustainable? Yes. Yes, that's what you read, and then you start pages of unless, until, but. So what's promising? Let's finish in a promising kind of line. Hundreds of reforms already agreed, okay, since 2019. More than 400, actually. But will this time be different? And will the reforms be implemented without delays and reversals? And how long does it take to turn around the private sector, to get trust and start getting foreign direct investment? Plus the hanging issue of the exchange rate. I remember 1992, first time I went to Jordan, and I got my briefing book on, we were then examining the impact of the IMF adjustment on the social sectors, especially when 500,000 returnees came from Kuwait. Then Jordan had 4 million people. 500,000 came, more than 10%. Now there are 4 million in Amman, 11 million in the country. This says something about the water also. So the issue here is how to turn the whole tanker around. It's not a speedboat. The positive, another positive thing is that the debt dynamics relatively improved. this is what I said. Jordan now is borrowing at a lower rate than its existing obligations in the past, as I say there. And finally, in the longer run, the issue remains. Will there be social resistance to reforms? And per capita incomes have declined to not in one generation, 10 years. So people remember how they were 10 years and say, what happened to us? Purchasing power has collapsed by 1/3. So, okay, you are keeping the Jordanian dinar pegged, but the purchasing power in Jordan, what they can buy, these people, the Jordanians now, has been crushed also. So some austerity is inevitable, but inflation will put a heavy distribution effect, especially, we know that, IMF and World Bank find that the impact, the distributional impact is very high on the less fortunate from an increase in inflation. Wages don't keep up. In fact, the government postponed by 2 years any consideration of increasing the minimum wage. So we're already in 2025 while inflation is going up. Granted, not as much as elsewhere, but it will have an impact. Now, another question mark is, will the private sector rebound, and will it rebound quickly? And in what sector? And what will be the impact on unemployment there? And finally, we assume, as the IMF, there will be no unpredictable events in place. And we hope external funding will continue unabated as it has been in the past. How am I doing?
You took the 2 times, yours and Dr. Ibrahim.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
But Dr. Ibrahim, are you online? Rightly so.
Hello, fine.
Okay,
I am online, Zafiris, but I'm enjoying listening as well. So, you know, I will not make an intervention. Just one thing that the competing objectives of long versus short term has also impeded any serious reform in terms of subsidies, because you mentioned the issue of subsidies, whether it's bread subsidies, electricity, or any other form of subsidies. It's really the core of which is politically and socially driven, but it's very clear that there is a distortion there and there is a heavy burden there, yet no government is daring to take the necessary surgical measures because they compare the short-term versus long-term gains politically that they might get out of such action. Otherwise, we discuss most of the things together, so I agree and I appreciate your taking the role of presenting this on behalf of both. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you, and what did I wanted to say? Yes, the questions will be for you, I think, because you can answer the things I didn't mention explicitly, including for the energy sector and the political economy of reforms that we have in the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zafiris. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. You were on time, both of you. Well, now I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Mustapha Nabli to be commenting on the paper. Let me first introduce Dr. Nabli, who's known to every one of us. Both papers? Second, you'll be commenting after Morocco? Okay, fine. Okay, so it's the paper on Morocco. Dr. Abdelaaziz, huh? Okay, let me introduce you first, Dr. Abdelaaziz. Thank you very much. Dr. Abdelaaziz Ali will be presenting the paper on the case of Morocco. Dr. Abdelaaziz is the principal economist and head of the research department, Policy Center for the New South. He is a principal economist and head of research at the Policy Center for New South. He joined the center in 2014 after 5 years of experience at the Central Bank of Morocco. He worked as an economist in the International Studies and Relations Department and was analyzing the real estate price index, financial asset prices for monetary policy and financial stability purposes. Since then, Dr. Abdelaaziz has focused on cyclical and structural issues of the Moroccan economy, including macroeconomic management and industrial policy design. He has published articles on the reform of the exchange rate regime in the Moroccan economy and its implications for the macroeconomic regulations, as well as the evolution of the macroeconomic framework over the last 2 decades. I will invite you to speak, please, Dr. Abdelaaziz. Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. And thanks, first of all, to our colleagues from the ERF and the FDL for including the Policy Center in this study. So this is a co-authored study by our colleagues from the Policy Center for the New South under the surveillance of a committee led by our president, Mr. Al-Ainawi, and our dear Professor Mr. Abdelkhalq Touhami and Professor Dorothée Boukenfossou. So this is the outline. So in the first part, I will try to lay down the main characteristics of the Moroccan economy that matters for the study of the debt sustainability. And here I will follow exactly the same pattern as our colleagues in the other cases. I will try to explain the different legacies of the past shocks that have affected the Moroccan economy, to what extent it has altered the orientation of the fiscal policy. And then I will talk specifically on the different challenges coming out of 2022 and 2023, also from a debt sustainability perspective. I will try to present briefly the model and how it frames all these dynamics. Then we will talk about some scenarios and simulation that has been run through the same model, and we'll talk about the different extension that we are doing right now, and we'll conclude with some policy recommendation. Although the model does not allow at this stage to draw any major recommendation, but what we'll try to share the different reforms, the different debate that is taking place here in Morocco. So we'll start with the most important factor that matters for debt sustainability, which is in fact growth. So the debt accumulations matters actually if it fuel economic growth. And here, in the case of Morocco, if you see in the last 2 decades, growth has actually lost momentum in general. So we've moved from an average of 4.5% during the first decade to something close to 3%, and this is a permanent loss of economic activity. So potential growth has lost something close to 1.5%. There are different factors explaining this trend. First of one is the global financial crisis. This has affected the Moroccan economy, but it took some time in order to affect economic activity and affect the different behaviors of economic agents. We have also what's going on in the European market, as Morocco is well anchored to the European market, and given that Europe is also slowing, this also has affected the Moroccan economy, and this poses different challenges for Morocco from a different perspective, the debt perspective, because it lowered the tax base, and also it pushes the authorities in order to increase their spending in order to support the economic activity. And from social perspective, although it's not tackled within this presentation, from a social perspective, a loss of 1.5 percentage growth means a loss of something close to 30,000 job losses every year. So permanently, the Moroccan economy is not creating 30,000 jobs, which is a major challenge from a political, social, economic viewpoint in the case of Morocco. Here I presented the non-agriculture GDP because the difference matters for the case of Morocco. Regarding the agriculture output, we moved from a sustained growth in the agriculture sector due to different factors, favorable climate conditions, a very ambitious program called the Plan Maroc Vert, or the Green Agriculture Plan, that have pushed capital deepening in the agriculture sector and allow increases in productivity. But since 2015, agriculture sector is recording almost no growth. Although the agriculture is exonerated, so it's not contributing to the tax base, but given its indirect effects on the manufacturing sector, on services sector, and also the revenues it generates for a large share of the population in the rural areas, no growth in the agriculture sector has a considerable implication for the economic activity in general and also for the debt sustainability. So since 2015, Morocco has went through very difficult rainfall conditions. So the climate shocks were extreme. For example, in the last year, we witnessed one of the most severe drought in the last 40 years. This is the case of all northern African countries and southern Europe. So the drought was extreme, and we see it in terms of the performance of the sector, as it has recorded, for example, last year, a contraction of economic activity close to 18%. So growth, no growth in the agriculture sector, plus the fact that non-agriculture sector has lost its momentum. So this represents a major risk and a challenge for the fiscal authorities. Regarding the financial conditions, this is also matters in terms of the leeway and the room that can open for authorities in order to fund their different programs. The central bank in Morocco is actually having a framework that is close to inflation targeters, although our anchor is still the exchange regime, but we are moving toward a more flexible exchange regime. So within an inflation that is close to 1%, and by the way, Morocco is one of the striking stylized facts of the Moroccan economy, that actually we don't know what does it mean inflation in the case of Morocco. And this, I will talk about this later, how it represents a risk given this context. So growth was around 1%, and this is why the central bank, with its mandate of price stability, has the capacity and ability to lower its policy rates toward an historical low level close to 2%. So this has supported also indirectly the capacity of the fiscal authorities to get funded at the domestic market, given that domestic debt, and I will talk about it later, represent the largest share in terms of the debt, and we have one of the most developed T-bills market in the case of Morocco compared to other financial compartments. For the external imbalances, Morocco is a typical case actually of the twin deficit. This is the case during the last decade, but things actually have changed with the COVID crisis, as the nature of the crisis has altered the economic activity in Morocco, and it is composed of a supply and demand shock. So we're expecting actually to see the current account to deteriorate in 2020. Actually, the IMF and the World Bank was expecting the deficit to be close to 10%, but we ended with something close to 1% of GDP. This is explained by the large amount of remittances, but mostly to the adjustment of imports. We were not expecting imports to adjust during this context, but the contraction of economic activity, one of the most important in the region, as we've seen growth have shrinked by something close to 7%, has affected imports, plus the terms of trade shock has lowered the pressure over the current account, and now it's around 1%, given the shock, or the deferable shock on terms of trade, especially oil products. The current account is at a sustainable level, funded mainly through the FDIs. Morocco draws in average something close to 2% FDI, and it's stable in the long run. So this does not pose any risks for authority. From this perspective, you see that international reserves is above this threshold of 3 months. So the authorities have the capacity to protect the peg and allow a smooth adjustment toward a much more flexible exchange rate. Regarding the fiscal, they mention, and here is one of the specificity for the Moroccan, is that the shock of the global financial crisis, we were not actually able to absorb it. It takes almost a decade for the Moroccan economy, for 2008 to 2018, to stabilize the debt. And 2019 was the first year when we were starting the deleveraging process, but then came the COVID crisis that had pushed the fiscal toward a higher level. Here I'm representing the public debt in general, considering the debt of the state-owned enterprise that actually matters also for the case of Morocco. So the COVID came at a time where we were initiating the diverging process, but then we moved towards a new plateau. So all this have represented major risks. And then 2022 came with the inflation. You see that we moved from an inflation on an average of 1% to something close to 10%. And I think one of the disadvantages of having such a low inflation is that we don't know how to deal once inflation is around 10%. We don't know how to deal with it. We've seen that public procurement for the case of Morocco have been disturbed, given that the contracts did not include any hedging dimension. So this has affected the contracts, and the labor market also was affected, as we were thinking that inflation will stay at this level. An increasing share of inflation right now is mostly food, which affects disproportionately the poor and vulnerable. But from a debt sustainability perspective, inflation actually, at least in the short term, is a good news for budget equilibriums. The focus in Morocco was on the impact on the spending, on the compensation fund, but inflation has also lowered the pressure over the fiscal authorities by, for sure, lowering the cost of borrowing, despite the tightening of financial conditions, either domestically, internationally. In real terms, it's still in the negative zone. Inflation has, in fact, or the price pressures have, in fact, inflated revenues much more than expected. We were expecting to end the year by a fiscal deficit of close to 6%, but we realized something close to 5%, so 1 percentage points gain due mainly to inflation, and of course this mechanic effect over debt to GDP. The negative side of it is actually the pressure over nominal yields. And this happened just before the monetary policy tightening. Economic agents in T-bills market were requiring a higher returns given the inflation. So we've seen a move of the yield curve toward an upper level, plus the fact that the central bank has reacted through 3 consecutive raises of policy rate by 1.5 percentage points. So inflation in general has a mitigated impact, but in globally the positive side of it take it. Another challenge in this year is the slow adjustment. Morocco has been known by a rigorous macro policy, if I may say. If we compare the adjustments between Morocco and other emerging economies, generally in the period, the duration of budgetary adjustment, we reduce our deficit by 4.6 in average, which is higher than the emerging or the low-income economies. Right now, the adjustment given the 3-year budgetary program is lower than is below the 2%, which means that we might be prone to accumulate debt and reduce this adjustment, this rapid adjustment that we've seen in history. Regarding the model, and here I will go
1 minute.
1 minute.
Why don't you get to the results?
Okay, so regarding the simulation, we have considered different shocks on inflation, real GDP growth, interest rates, and this is what the model is presenting us, is that generally, except for the pessimistic scenarios, the adjustment of debt will be at around 75% of GDP. In the most pessimistic scenario, where the toll of the COVID crisis will affect the supply capacities, in this case that we will see debt increasing at an exponential rate. The interest rates also will go, or the weight of interest rates payment will go beyond 3%, but will adjust in the next year. So to conclude, should we worry about this debt evolution? I think yes. The context is very difficult. There are some implications of the COVID, of the recent development at the international level, that still we don't understand how it will affect in the long term the economy. But at the same time, there are signals actually that Morocco can withstand this context and this turmoil. The first one is a different, I would say, positive perceptions by international investors, and in this case the IMF. Morocco has actually a close relation with the IMF. We are, I think, one of the 2 countries that have been eligible to what we call the precautionary line of liquidity, and Morocco have been able to draw from it. And in order to be eligible to this kind of liquidity line, we have to satisfy certain macroeconomic conditions. Now, more lately, Morocco have been able to access to what we call the flexible credit line arrangement of Morocco that allow the IMF to give a kind of policy insurance that Morocco is globally, from a macro perspective, is stable. The second thing is the perception of Morocco for the international investors. You see that the premium, Morocco has always been able to keep a premium below what emerging markets are paying. And Morocco, I think, with Jordan, were the only countries in the region were able to get access to the international markets in this year. So the challenge is there, but there are some positive signals within this bad news. 1 minute, and I will finish. Regarding the different extensions that we're working on, the first one is to endogenize economic growth, and here we will follow the same path as our colleagues from Sudanese. We will try to customize the model in order to include some specificities of the Moroccan case, like the participation, the woman participation, or the different impacts of the investment in Morocco, especially the public investments. So those are dimensions that we are working on. Unfortunately, we were not able to present them. We're still trying to fine-tune the model. We're also trying to endogenize this arbitrage between domestic and external funding, and also the fiscal revenues. This is one thing that we're trying to include given the recent debate. Regarding the policy recommendation, and I will finish, there are different reforms on the agenda in Morocco. The first one is related to the fiscal one. As in Morocco, we have one of the highest tax burden, I would say, in the region. If we just compare it with an economy like Jordan, we are 7 percentage points higher. So there is a clear debate about equity in the tax system, as there are some sectors that do not pay their taxes. So the reform launched years ago is regarding much more equity, much more extension of the tax base. The second one is related to much more fiscal rules. As you know, monetary policy is well framed under very direct and very transparent and accountable rules, while it's not so the case for fiscal rules. This is the case not only of Morocco, but different emerging markets. So we're trying to put in place fiscal rules that will give much more transparent to economic agents, but at the same time we have to find this equilibrium between setting a fiscal rule that will allow much more visibility to economic agents, but also avoid
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdelaaziz. You took much more than your time. Okay. Thank you. So and maybe you'll have a chance during the discussion.
I finished.
Thank you. Now, I will give the floor to Dr. Mustapha Nabli. Is Dr. Kevin here with us today or online?
Online.
Dr.
I'm
Kevin.
online.
You are online. Thank you. Okay. Dr. Nabli, I guess Dr. Nabli does not need any introduction, but I'll do that. Dr. Mustapha Nabli is a former governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia and former Minister of Planning and Economic Development of Tunisia. He has also served as the chief economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank. He is an ERF senior associate. Please go ahead, doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Abla. Dr. Mahdi, sorry. I was not assigned one paper to comment, so I read both papers and I'm commenting both papers. So I didn't know that I was supposed to be.
10 minutes, Dr. Mahdi.
Yes, exactly. So, so I had to read the two papers and I had to try to figure out what to say about these two papers. The first thing that I would like to say that I try to figure out, okay, these two countries are in this session together. Is it by chance that they're together?
I don't know, you have to ask Dr. Badawi.
No, I'm answering the question. I'm asking, I'm answering. And so, and I said, it's not by chance, actually. The two countries have many characteristics in common. And let me tell you two or three of them. Both countries are kingdoms. Out of the 6 countries, they're the only ones who are kingdoms. They're royal families. So they have long-term political stability, contrary to all the other countries. Second characteristic, both countries have been experiencing deteriorating growth over the last decade or two. Third, both countries have pursued a peg, more or less hard peg of their currency, which together with Lebanon are the major countries in the region who have been following peg. We know about Lebanon. So the question is this peg going to be having the same impact that it has in Lebanon over the recent past? So there are many things that are similar in these countries, and I don't want one of them that has come out from the presentation on fiscal policy. Morocco seems to be in general more rigorous fiscal policy than Jordan. Jordan tends to have a more lax fiscal policy. It's less disciplined in terms of policy on the fiscal side, and so on. So the upshot of this is that really we have two countries that are very interesting for the overall total, because dealing with the question of sustainability of debt in this context is very interesting and very difficult, as you have seen. So given that, I asked myself, okay, this project asks two questions. The first one, can we say for that country at this given point in time that debt is sustainable or not? Is there an answer to that question? And second, what is the prospect for using the growth lever to solve debt sustainability problems? And here I would like to say what I draw from this discussion from these papers in terms of these two questions. The question of debt sustainability. As you have seen, for Jordan, they did not do any debt sustainability analysis themselves. The authors, they depended on the IMF results. And you have seen that in Morocco, there has been some work to work out some debt sustainability scenarios and so on. But from both results, the broad conclusion that you get, yes, we can say that both countries have sustainability. But maybe not. So which is stronger? Is it yes or the but? I don't know. Because when you read the Jordan discussion, yes, if the debt does not include the assets of the social security corporations, if you don't count the donors and and so on, yes, it's sustainable. But if not, maybe not. So we really don't know. The question of sustainability remains open, at least in the case of Jordan. And in the case of Morocco, maybe not as risky as in Jordan, but still there are issues of that sustainability. Because the scenarios that are considered in Morocco are very, very narrow range scenarios. The shocks that are considered are very, very small compared to the possible potential size of the shocks. If you have a shock of 1% lower GDP growth, you become unsustainable. How about if it's higher then? What happens? And the shock, I mean, even the first graph of Morocco, the growth rate has declined from 4.5 to 1.5 already. In the past, we have seen it happen. So a shock of 1.5 or 2% is not unheard of. It's something that happens. Therefore, I think in the Moroccan case, while the risks are lower, are less significant than in Jordan, but I think they are present and they should be recognized more readily than they are in the paper, in my view. And the scenarios should reflect that. This leads me to the second question about the growth, potential growth, because as everybody said, and the IMF and everybody, okay, if you can grow out of the debt stress, that's the better solution for everybody, right? So the question is that possibility, is that lever available to us in Jordan and Morocco today? And when you read the papers, broadly speaking, the answer is no. The answer is no. The Jordan paper goes at long length trying to explain how the private sector has deteriorated over time, over the last 2 decades. And how can you expect a private sector that has, you know, and Zafiris just told us the details of that. How do you expect this to be used as a lever to grow now, today, and respond to the needs of this, fiscal adjustment or the debt sustainability of the country? It's very difficult to imagine. I mean, you really, and you have seen the story of the reforms of the private sector. It's dismal. It's a story of repeated failures to do anything or to make progress. And the reforms, they're counted by the hundreds of reforms. When you start counting by the hundreds of reforms, to me, they're failed already. You cannot, reforms by the hundred are not reforms to my mind, because it means that you are not really focusing on the substantial, the most important issues. For instance, the PEG. Are you dealing with the PEG or not? Neither the Jordan paper nor the Morocco paper deals with the PEG issue. Is it an important lever to use to stimulate growth, competitiveness, and therefore private sector development? This issue is important. It has not been, it's not being put on the table. Are there other instruments? Probably yes, but I don't know which ones are the most important ones. But what I know is that I think in the initial phases of the project, we thought about, okay, what would be the package of reforms that countries are advised to pursue to shift growth? Which means that we should have a scenario with an upside. An upside scenario compared to the baseline, continuation of the current trends, where you have growth which is much higher. Okay, in Morocco, from 5%, say. From Jordan, from 2.5 or 3 to 5% or 4% or whatever it is. Then you work out what is needed to achieve that. What would the package of reforms be that the country should pursue to have that? So the upside scenario, but at least the non-existence of the upside scenarios tell me something, actually. The non-existence of the upside scenario tells me that the authors don't believe that it's possible. Actually, they don't believe it is possible. They think that the countries are stuck in the low growth, and they continue, and possibly even lower growth, because they have the downside scenarios. but they don't have the upside scenario. So the fact that they're not pursuing that route is really telling, which is fine for me, but at least it should be discussed by the papers and should be put on the table. There are many other things that I can do, but I will stop here. Okay? That's enough.
Hello?
That's enough.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nabli. You raised a very important point, actually, a lot of important points, but one of them is not considering a high growth scenario. Why not? Yani, I mean, are we so pessimistic to that extent that we do not take that into consideration and work on it? Well, we have with us today Dr. Kevin Carey, who will be commenting on the two papers as well. Let me please present him. Dr. Kevin Carey, Climate Economics Program Manager at the World Bank's Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions Practice Group. Prior to this role, he was an advisor on global and regional macroeconomic issues, covering debt sustainability globally and macroeconomic challenges of the various countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Previously, he was a practice manager for macroeconomics in the MENA region. In these roles, he managed strategic financing operations such as in Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, Palestinian territories, diagnostic studies and reports across the region, technical assistance to the GCC countries, monitoring of macroeconomic conditions and coordination with World Bank regional management and IMF. It's a very long summary, and I would like to invite Dr. Kevin Carey to give us his comment on the two papers. Please go ahead, Doctor.
Thanks very much, and I'll try to stick to 5 minutes, just 3 sets of comments on the two papers, and it goes without saying I'd rather be there in Egypt with the colleagues. I'm sure the coffee breaks will be interesting. A lot of what I'll say will overlap with what Mustapha said. So the first thing to remark was, I think from both papers you see the lingering effects of the so-called Arab Spring. Both of these countries, the middle-income monarchies, used public debt to absorb the social tensions at that time through continuation or even increase of subsidies and pay increases. As Abdelaaziz mentioned, Morocco was probably just getting around to trying to reverse some of that increase in 2019 when the next shock came. But the consequence of that higher public debt and the higher debt service associated with it is that there was a squeeze on other types of spending, and in particular public investment, I think, got squeezed in both countries. In Jordan, the effect was more severe, and that's because the shock, the interruption in the gas supply from Egypt, this was a much more severe shock than anything that Morocco experienced. That could not be smoothed quickly. But the other thing, I think, hitting Jordan harder than Morocco was the fall in rents or the support from other countries. I think Zafiris mentioned a figure in his paper. It's a really steep decline in the official support to Jordan during the last decade. So both of these things really caused a major squeeze in Jordan in particular, but both countries saw a squeeze in public investment, and for Morocco, as Abdelaaziz mentioned it in the main paper, it had been investment that had really driven that more successful growth experience prior to the Arab Spring. The second thing I want to talk about is the exchange rate. Mustapha also mentioned this. First on Morocco, I think Abdelaaziz mentioned it briefly at the end, but this upgrade that Morocco has from the precautionary and liquidity line, the PLL, to the flexible credit line, this is a major upgrade. If you look at the terminology for those two programs, you need sound macro policies for the precautionary and liquidity line, very strong macro policies for the flexible credit line. I mean, I remember, and I know there are those in the room that will remember, Morocco was the only user of the precautionary and liquidity line for most of the time that was on it. And we would ask, why not shift to the flexible credit line? And the answer that would come was you would need the exchange rate to be more flexible than it was at the time. So that shift in judgment, I think, from sound to very strong, it represents, among other things, an assumption that Morocco will be willing to use the exchange rate as a shock absorber. Abdelaaziz has a chart. I maybe didn't have time to show it. The actual exchange rate movement in Morocco is relatively small. There was a band and then a wider band. If you compare to the size of shocks that Morocco has experienced, it's not huge movement. So I think this is something we'll need to watch. Will the exchange rate be allowed to play that shock absorber role? It's certainly the assumption that's embedded in the flexible credit line, which puts Morocco more in the company of Latin American countries with very strong macro, like Mexico and Chile. So I think this is a significant change in the landscape. Jordan is a peg, as Mustapha mentioned. And I think if we think about the constraints on the private sector, Zafiris, the paper spends a lot of time on this. I think the overvaluation has to be part of the constraint on the private sector. I mean, anyone who visits Amman, can see the impact on prices. The Dutch disease the type of Dutch disease that Jordan has that shows up in prices. So that part of the story, private sector growth would certainly help with the denominator, but can you get the private sector growth with the peg and with the amount of overvaluation that's associated with that? Finally, in the spirit of the report from last year about the more forward-looking aspect, what's the alternative to an austerity approach for these countries? Definitely, I think climate has to be a big part of that, and within that, I think infrastructure has to be a big part of that. What would be the upside scenario be for Jordan, for example? Now, as the paper, the Jordan paper, they mentioned in the text that the IMF showed, not as part of their main staff report, but in an annex, they showed an adaptation scenario for Jordan, where Jordan spends more on adaptation, and the debt to GDP ratio is 2 percentage points higher, so a slight increase in debt. Now, if you look at that scenario more closely, growth is also higher. Jordan grows faster in that alternative scenario that the IMF presented. And in fact, the result is that if you go out 15 or 20 years, the debt to GDP scenario, the debt to GDP ratio is lower than it would be if those adaptation investments were not made. So what are those adaptation investments? Well, it's not quite said in the IMF annex, but it's essentially the Aqaba to Amman conveyor. Everybody who knows Jordan, water issues in Jordan, and I'm embarrassed to be talking with Dr. Ibrahim listening about this, but you're essentially in Jordan, you're pumping water uphill to where most of the people live. So the energy costs associated with desalinating on the coast and then pumping the water uphill to Amman are very high. Now the IMF assumption was that since water is constraining growth in Jordan, if you do these investments, you can increase growth. To be honest, on the bank side, our internal discussion was more water is going to lower growth in the future in Jordan. So by making these investments, you're just keeping growth where it is now. So it's a discussion, is the upside scenario one where we're able to increase growth more than it is now, or where we're able to keep growth just at its current level, but we have to make more investments to do that. Morocco also has a water challenge, but I think more diversified ways of dealing with it. I mean, Jordan does have some rainfall, some dams, it can desalinate. Morocco has more options for dealing with water than Jordan, but these again are going to require investments. And the challenge, I think the social challenge that's going to run into is pricing. We know throughout the region, throughout the MENA region, there is enormous resistance to water pricing. So to deal with the water challenge, you're going to need investments, but then you're going to be straight into what pricing would you be willing to attach to water, and then in the background to energy, what prices would you be willing to attach to energy to deal with that? In Jordan in particular, because energy costs will be embedded in the cost of water because of this pumping issue. Now, I think the risk I would see in both countries that the adaptation response to the climate challenge will actually be maladaptation, meaning, adaptation that's actually worsening the long-term problem. So that would mean more drilling, more groundwater drilling, more desalination with all the energy and all the environmental costs associated with that, and energy and water costs that are just ultimately covered by debt because of the concern about pricing. I think the spirit of last year's report was to say what's something that the elite could be into that could also have broader support with the population. I think we have to think, would the elite choose a good adaptation response or a maladaptation response? If there was a way, instead of the debt snowballing that Zafiris talked about, could we be talking about sort of a climate snowballing or an environmental snowballing, where we're doing these responses to get more water, but they're actually making the long-term problem worse? So how to get that long-term horizon into these climate responses that are badly needed, how to overcome that maladaptation issue, I think that this is going to be critical. So I think, just to close, two things I think we need to watch. In Jordan, I think we need to watch this issue of the mega projects in water particularly closely, because the fiscal implications of those projects will be large. Dr. Ibrahim will know the previous issues that NEPCO had. I think there's another set of those issues coming with water. I think Morocco, the short-term issue is the exchange rate and its role as a shock absorber. The longer-term issue is water. How will the state-owned enterprises in the water sector in Jordan, will they be allowed to cover their costs? If they can't cover their costs by pricing, what would be the space to cover their costs from other sources? So I think this is maybe the forward-looking agenda in both countries. Hopefully a non-austerity agenda, but one that will need a long-term perspective. Let me stop there, and looking forward to the Q&A. Over.
Can you hear me? I just have one comment, and then we'll open the floor for like 10 minutes maximum for discussion. Whenever I read a paper about structural adjustment in our MENA region, and I see it written everywhere that our current problems are due to the shocks like the COVID pandemic and recently the Ukraine war. I guess we are overstating the role of those two shocks, especially the Ukraine war. We are understating our structural issues. The structural issues within our countries are much more severe, and the situations that we are going through right now are basically due to those structural imbalances, lack of support to the private sector, lack of a good institutional setup that would encourage everyone to work, flourish, develop, a policy in the exchange rate and the interest rate that are not clear even to the policymakers themselves. So we do have a lot of structural problems that if we start to seriously deal with them and quickly deal with them, a shock like the Ukrainian war wouldn't matter that much, and we won't be discussing it that much. I'm not going to talk anymore. I'll open the floor for discussion. Do you have any questions? Yes, please. And then Dr. Samir, and then Dr. Ibrahim.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a quick question for Zafiris. Zafiris, you said that the unemployment problem in Jordan is mainly male unemployment, and that you showed us that female unemployment is very low. But the last time I looked at Jordan's labor market statistics, which was a while back, female labor participation rates were dismally low. It was actually the lowest in the MENA region, around 18%. So is this what, is it really a problem of male unemployment, or do we also have a problem of women not entering the labor market?
Thank you. Dr. Makdisi? Dr. Samir, please do. Go ahead.
Jordan and Morocco, should we not take the regional context into account? I mean, I guess that Jordan suffers from, you know, the Palestinian issue, suffers from the Syrian instability, from the refugee influx that they have. So, I mean, when we're talking about impact, I think I did not hear anything about regional context of things. I think Morocco, if I'm not mistaken, is more stable in North Africa, is a more stable region than the volatile Middle East in which we live, and which from both Jordan and Lebanon, of course, suffer a lot. My second point has to do with the question of debt sustainability, and I was wondering, I think Mustapha referred to it, and I think if I'm not mistaken, he was asking the question is, how could the same people who were responsible for the growth of debt cope with solving the problem of the debt, if I understood you correctly, Mustapha?
Good point. Thank you, Dr. Mustapha. Dr. Ibrahim?
Thank you. I would like to thank the two lead commentators for bringing the issue of the exchange rate, because I really think there is something very idiosyncratic about our region. There are two things. Either the constituency who benefit the most from real currency devaluation, correcting overvaluation, and if possible even increasing the competitiveness of the economy. Either they don't really have a voice, like the community of farmers and industrialists and so on. And this is a political economy issue that I think would be quite interesting to analyze in the context of this project. The other thing is the left-wing politics. I experienced this in Sudan, and I'm sure it's around, that they tend to think of exchange rate as a symbol of sovereignty. Right. Even nominal exchange rate as a symbol of sovereignty, which is really not the case. And just I conclude with a very interesting story. My former colleague and friend Klaus Schmidt-Hebel, who is attending the conference, told me that at the central bank, he was the director of research at the central bank. And Chile, which is a very successful country, emerging market country, was pursuing or is still pursuing inflation targeting, which means that you don't tamper with the exchange rate. So during the copper boom, the agro-industrial community could not export. So basically they forced the government to abandon the inflation target for a while until they ride out the boom. So I think the political economy is equally important here.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. I was asked to shorten this, to end this session. So I'll just leave it to one extra question, because the coffee break will be only 5 minutes. If you have an extra question, you can ask, or else we can close this session and go to the coffee break.
No answers? No responses?
Okay, do you have a question? Responses? Okay, 2 minutes, huh? And then Dr. Ali will have 2 minutes as well.
Yes. and Dr. Ali can follow. First, thanks the commentators, and I could have spoken less if I knew what they were going to say, because they said it better, and they expanded it also. So on the first question, what is the answer that Mustapha asked? I will rephrase it in two questions, and I will give very clear answers. Is the debt sustainable? Yes. Should we worry? Yes. So I think this covers the answer.
So this is the first point.
The first point. The second point is, I think I started talking about 1992 when I first went to Jordan, and I didn't complete the sentence because I look at you and you were looking at me. So I cut it short. The point I wanted to mention is when I got my briefing book from Washington and I was going to Jordan, there was a sentence there: the exchange rate is off the table. If you mention it, you are out of what was his name? Then the Minister of Planning, then became Governor of the Central Bank. So the peg has been off the table since that time, and this is a point where Jordan had policy coherence. Everything else has gone up and down, but the peg has been maintained, and there are all the things that were mentioned about what the impact will be on the trade balance, and also on the domestic banks. I mean, the World Bank says again that yes, they are okay, well capitalized, but, and there is again a laundry list of things there. I think I will just answer the issue of Hafiz and Dr. Mahdi. Yes, it's a low rate, but it's a rate. The unemployment rate of women is 40%, of men is 20%. But if you took the numbers, it is the numbers at the end that will be affected by the volume of investment. Second, as we say in the paper, and the international experience, women's labor force participation in Europe, it was 15 and 20%, until the conditions became really tight in the labor market after the 30 glorious years, the Trump glorious, whatever they call them. It's only when wages increase and the labor market becomes tight and male unemployment goes down that women come into the labor market. So it's one thing dealing with the rates, and of course there's the cost of underutilization of half of the population. But however, from the development mechanics and dynamics, women do not work, do not come into the labor market until the tides are very, the labor market is very tight. It's under these conditions, it is the very educated women who go and the very poor women who are pushed into the labor market.
Thank you, Dr. Zafiris.
Just to Dr. Mahdi, right? Yes, I agree with you. That was a slogan in Greece. Can those who created the crisis solve the crisis? And we'll go back to Plato, who guards the guardians. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much. Dr. Abdelaaziz, please go ahead.
So just want to say a word swiftly on the sustainability of that. We do believe that this is still sustainable for a simple reason, is that beyond the econometrics, is that people in charge are talking about, are still have in their mind the structural adjustment plan that we've been through in the 80s and the 90s. So people now in charge, even in the unions, they're talking about the risk that Morocco lose its sovereignty when it comes to macroeconomic policy. So they know that they have to take some decisions in order to restore the economic stability. So the way economic policy is handled in Morocco, I think will allow adjustments at some cases at very high cost, but the adjustment will be done. Regarding the reform of exchange rates, we started actually the discussion about this reform in the beginning of the 2000s, in the first decade, and then came the financial crisis, so everything forgot about it. And then we started discussing it in 2016 when the central banks having a clear communication about the implication of this reform, how financial agents should be adapted to this new context. And the first step we took it in 2018 with enlarging the fluctuation of the dirham, and then the second step was taken just at the eve of the COVID crisis, and now we're planning for the third step in the next year. So So in Morocco, economic policy, for us, the reforms, they take some time. This is also reflects, as Mr. Mustapha said, the fact that we are a kingdom, the fact that we are a millennium, and we take some time in our reform. So all the history of the country matters when it comes to implementing something like this. So we see this kind of reform in the next decade will lead to much more flexible exchange regime, but the reform is on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdelaaziz. Thank you very much, everybody, the speakers, the commentators, and those who commented on everything. Thank you very much for all the audience. Let's go to the coffee break and come quickly.